Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to have you join me here in the gorgeous morning sunrise at, the sun of the morning at St. Andrews in Oakville, where I live. When this pandemic began, being the pastor of a parish, it was very important that we send to our parishioners words of encouragement, because there was a lot that we didn't know about what was going to happen. And anybody who knows me they know that I like words, and I like poetry. I like something that's well written, and if it has a particular meaning, can be very, very helpful. And one night early in the pandemic, I was listening to the BBC News, and one of their reporters, who was Irish, Fergal Keane, suddenly started to speak these beautiful words from an Irish philosopher and poet named John O'Donoghue, who died unexpectedly just a few years ago. But this is the piece, and I've noticed over the last several months that it's appearing in many different places. He writes, "This is a time to be slow, to lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself at your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning." There are some lovely images in that little passage, which is why I think that it is very, very helpful. For so many of us, the COVID experience has brought us personally to conversations about what it means to live and what it means to die. What are our values? And what are we willing to commit to? And what are we willing to let go of? If you remember early in the pandemic, the frightening images that we were seeing, mostly from overseas, but images also from our own communities, and as a pastor in a parish, the phone calls after the second or third week of funerals, very few having anything to do with a COVID death. But nonetheless, funerals, mourning, grieving is now done in a very different way. I think one of the things that's also happened in the pandemic experience, and I think that Donoghue, he touches on that, is that suddenly words are taking on very difficult meaning for us. Words such as distancing. That's not the way we usually live our lives, or at least most of us live our lives. How many of us had ever thought about living in a bubble? Usually we would have talked about a bubble as a place of isolation, but now we're creating bubbles for safety reasons. I think one of the hardest ones of all that we've experienced is the language around no touching, or the fear of touching. Yesterday I went to greet someone on the anniversary of a very important event in their lives, and somebody whom I've enormous respect for, and normally it would be with a big, bear hug. But yesterday it was just a nod, almost in that lovely, elegant, oriental way to acknowledge how appreciative I was of this person. No touching has become almost an obsession with us. Something else that's happened is that we're learning to communicate with our eyes. We had confirmation and First Communion here in the parish recently, and one of the sad things, especially in speaking to the children, is you can't see the whole reaction of their faces. You can only see the reaction from their eyes. But one of maybe the positive things is that we're learning to read people's eyes a little bit better. Sanitizing. When this is all over, I'm sure there will be a mass burning of sanitizing bottles, but that feeling on your hands after you've sanitized yourself for about the 50th time in a day, that word has a completely new meaning because of the experiences that we've had. And one of the toughest words again is probably the word isolation. This morning I had a conversation with somebody that I wanted to see one-on-one because we need to do some work together, and because of a medical reason that came up last week, and she used the word herself. She said, I have to go into self-isolation, and that brings with it another very negative thought or a negative idea. So I think that's one of the things that John O'Donoghue is saying to us, that we have to hold these new experiences with language in the tension of the time in which we live, and it's going to be very important for us to hold it, because in time we will be able to let it grow, or not grow, but go. People often ask, so what do we need? We've all of these negative things. What do we need to pay attention to? I think the biggest thing that we need to pay attention to is loneliness. And I think loneliness has invaded more lives than we think. And one of the good questions that I think is helpful for ourselves personally is that on the loneliness scale, where do we find ourselves? Because loneliness is about recognizing that something has left, something has gone, that isolation has crept in. I think mental health issues have become huge in the last little while. Listening to the stories of children and how much they miss their friends. How much in the last few weeks here where I live, our numbers seem to be high again, and with schools reopening, we've also had a number of outbreaks in schools, and parents are they're pulling back again. And when you meet children, especially in the grocery store or out and about when they're walking around here, even without asking, they talk about, it's what I miss. I miss my friends. I miss not being able to go out, and with that comes other big issues, the mental health issues of people struggling with employment issues, struggling keeping businesses afloat, the mental health issues that are coming with those on the front lines every day, who have to go through all of these different procedures. In the parish, grief, I think, has become a very big issue that people grapple with and deal with. When the COVID experience finished, we had 17 funerals on the list that we were not able to celebrate during the time of the lockdown, and slowly we've been whittling that list down. And I've discovered that while the service that was delayed is very, very important, what's even more important is that people have an opportunity to tell somebody else about the burden of grief that they've been carrying. Grief postponed is something that a lot of people are carrying, and often that grief postponed may not actually have anything to do with somebody dying. It could be the grief of isolation, the grief of not being employed, of not being able to work, the grief of distance from family, not being able to see family. It's one thing to speak to people on the telephone. It's one thing to be able to use the wonderful technology that we're able to see each other in the conversations. But it's the grief of the absence of the one that we love physically close to us. I think one of the things that's also interesting that's happened during the COVID time is that it's brought the churches back to basics. And by that I mean that the churches have had to find a new way to be able to communicate with their parishioners. Many churches have done very, very well with it, and many churches have failed miserably with it. And I think that one of the challenges that brings with it is that as we move out of this pandemic, there's going to be a renegotiating with the way that we engage with church. I think, for example, for those churches that have found ways to be present in people's homes on the weekend, moving forward, that is more than likely going to have to become a permanent feature of parish life. And it's reminding us that one of the gifts coming out of the pandemic experience is that parishes that have found ways to connect with their parishioners at home are now connecting with far, far more people on the weekend than they may have been in connecting with people as they were attending church on the weekend. We're finding that here, that the senior citizens, those who were ill, who couldn't come even in non-pandemic times to church, are now connected with church in another way. Groups in parishes have found ways to connect with parishioners. The CWL, for example, have done marvelous work in many parishes to reach out, to pick up the phone, to talk to somebody. If there's one heroic figure that emerges, and there are many, many heroic figures that have emerged in the pandemic experience, I think one of the figures that has emerged in terms of faith and spirituality, it's the figure of Pope Francis. And because visuals are so important, one of the images that will survive his papacy long after he is no longer Pope is the evening that he called the whole world, if you remember, in March, when things were so bad in Italy in particular, to pray for those who were ill with the COVID virus, but to pray also for those who were on the front lines. And remember how, as he walked up to the platform, he walked through an empty St. Peter's Square, which is, if anybody's ever been to St. Rome or spent any time around St. Peter's Square, you know that never happens. But that image of emptiness and alone, he took and turned it on its head and proclaimed to the whole world that in this pandemic, no one is alone and no one needs to be alone, that God is with us and that God will be with us through the experience. So this morning, as we begin this time of reflection with each other, I think it would be very interesting to maybe write down this question somewhere, and later to look at it, and maybe this can be part of our conversation this afternoon. What has your experience been? And is there one particular word that would describe what your experience was? And that can become very interesting. I notice here in the parish that when I ask people purposely, what has your experience been over the last few months? People come back with a response, and suddenly, as if this is an important thought, I get this response, thank you for asking. Nobody's ever asked me that question. But I think it is an important question, because we need to know what has my experience been? Can I give an accounting of the last several months? And what one word would you use to describe the experience of the last number of months? Now, these next two questions get to be a little bit more personal. Over the last several months, can you identify what your low point was? Questions like this are an important part of the retreat experience. So if there was a low point, what was it? And the question that accompanies that, as we continue in the experience, what gives you hope? Where's the hope? So as I said, we're going to, maybe those are the questions that we'd like to come back to a little bit later in the experience. When I was talking with Therese a number of months ago about this retreat, we had a long conversation, and as I was listening to what our expectations for the morning was, I said, Therese, what would you think of spending a little bit of time with the gospel story of the road to Emmaus? And being the very sharp person that she is, she said, but isn't that an Easter gospel? And I said, yes, and that's precisely why I would like to use it, even though we're going into the season of Advent. Because I think there's something wonderful in the story, and as you heard it read in morning prayer, as the disciples walk with Jesus, something extraordinary happens to them. And so for maybe the next few minutes, if we can, I'd like to unpack a little bit what happens. And again, if you go back to O'Donoghue's lovely poem, there's an expectation in his text that even though the experience may be something we're unsure of, maybe there's fear in the experience, that somewhere there is light and hope in the experience, that going through it, we're going to come out on the other side different and changed. And that perfectly summarizes, for me certainly, what the story of the road to Emmaus is all about. And it also brings that lovely image of Pope Francis standing there completely alone, except for his assistant, on that dais in that evening in March, as he's praying for the whole world, during this pandemic experience. So what is it that happens in the story of the Road to Emmaus that excites me and gives me some insights for Advent? The first thing that I think that happens in this lovely story is that we see Jesus walking side by side with the disciples, and he asks them what's happening, what's going on. Your faces look downcast, or guys, you look like you've just lost your best friend. What's the matter? What's happened? And the disciples respond, are you the only one coming from Jerusalem who hasn't heard about Jesus of Nazareth, how they took him? And I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but you can almost see Jesus looking at them and saying, no, tell me about him. I think there's something very, very healing in that question. And it goes back to the little comment I was making about when you ask someone, what has your experience been during the COVID experience? And my experience is that many people have said, thanks for asking. I haven't thought about that before. So Jesus asks the disciples, what's happening here? Have you noticed in the culture how everybody is telling us what's happening? And how often we're being told from outside even how we should feel and how we should respond. But in this lovely, intimate way, Jesus is asking the question, so guys, what's happening? And the second thing that he does is that as they walk along, you'll notice in the story, there's a friendship that develops. And as the friendship develops, a door is opened for a deeper conversation. There's a wonderful writer, his name is Pico Iyer, and I talk about him a lot. He's Pico Iyer really professes no religious affiliation, but he has done some superb work on the meaning of silence in a world of noise. And that's one of the things he talks about, is the opportunities for that soul and heart conversation to take place between friends and strangers, where a door is opened and we have the opportunity for that heart-to-heart conversation. And that's exactly what Jesus does as they're walking along the road. Tell me about him. And after he has established that trust with the disciples, and the door to this intimate dialogue has opened, then what happens is that there's an honesty to the conversation and to the dialogue that's happening between them. They can put off all the defense mechanisms. They look at each other. They're walking forward with great purpose, and in that trust, they're able to get to the heart of the matter. And then one of the interesting things that happens after the conversation starts, you'll notice in the story that the disciples open themselves to Jesus. And one of them says to Jesus as they're walking along, you know, we were his disciples. And again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. We were his disciples. And our hope had been that he was the Messiah, the one that we had waited so long for. You can almost, because we don't get all of the dialogue in the conversation, and you could almost hear Jesus say to that disciple, wow, Wow. And now, and how do you feel about the disappointment that you carry? See how the door is opened, and the conversation is going to that little bit of a deeper place. The next thing that happens is this lovely thing that happens when you've had, sometimes when you have that heart-to-heart conversation with somebody, and you get up from the table, or you get up from wherever you have that conversation, and you feel as if your heart has opened. You feel as if you have been unburdened and almost even set free. And what happens is that in the conversation, because the trust is there, because the openness is there, you've been able to look at the issue, you've been able to look at the topic, you've been able to share the problem or the difficulty. Remember that disciple? We had hoped that he was the Messiah. But this is what happened. And then the wonderful thing that happens in the gospel story is that Jesus, after he hears what's in their heart, he goes on in the story to take the scriptures, to use the scriptures. This lovely line that they're going to use later in the gospel story, he opens their minds in this lovely dialogue and conversation that has taken place. And one of the interesting things that happens in the story as well is that the disciples, they re-examine their commitments. And as we see in the story, as Jesus walks with them and talks with them about the passages from the scriptures that referred to the Messiah, the penny is dropping for the disciples. Hadn't thought of that before. That's an interesting insight. Could you say that again? Now that makes sense. What Jesus does with the disciples on the road to Emmaus is that he opens up for them what was hidden in their lives, and now that it is no longer hidden and is revealed, there's a new life and a new energy. Just think about a moment that you've been in a conversation with somebody, and just out of the blue, somebody says something to you, and you say, "I'd never thought of that before. I've never heard it put like that before." I think that's what happens to the disciples when they get to Emmaus and they're sitting at the table, and he prays the Berekah, he prays the lovely prayer at the beginning of the meal at the table. This recognition suddenly comes into their lives and into their minds. Could it be? Is it? It is. Yes. That aha moment of enlightenment suddenly descends on them. And what happens at the table when that aha moment comes is that there's a new strength and there's a new energy that comes into their lives. Oy vey, you can almost hear them saying, "Oy vey, I understand it now. I see it much, much more clearly." When O'Donoghue speaks in that lovely poem about lying low, and taking it in, taking what the experience in, I think that's what the disciples have been doing on the road to Emmaus. They've walked with a stranger, they've talked with him, they're willing to listen, and now that they've broken bread with the stranger, the penny drops. And the word of God strengthens them in a way. Dabar Yahweh that has walked with them during the ministry of Jesus in the Galilee, all the way up into Jerusalem, all of a sudden it bubbles to the surface and it comes to life. And they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. They recognize Jesus in the stranger. And what's their first instinct? Their first instinct is to leave Emmaus immediately and go back to Jerusalem. That's why that last part of the gospel is often the most forgotten piece of the gospel, because the disciples have found something hidden has come to the surface, and they're so filled with the joy and enthusiasm of what was hidden, they cannot contain themselves, and so they race back to Jerusalem and race up to the room where the disciples are. You'll never guess what happened to us. We met him on the road. He walked with us and he talked with us. He broke bread with us. He is alive. So you might be saying to yourself, and what does all that excitement have to do with the season of Advent? When you journey with the beautiful readings from the Old Testament season that lead us to the birth of Christ, those Old Testament readings come out of an experience of longing for the day that light will come into our lives and enlightenment will come to us, and that longing for an experience that will open our eyes to the God who is among us. Remember the promise of the Lord, especially in coming out of the exile experience, is that one day I will come and walk among you. And in the history of Israel, and as the Old Testament readings unfold, but particularly the Gospel readings, especially from the 17th of December on, as those Gospel readings are heard, a few after the exile are faithful to the hope that we will live in the time of the fulfillment of the promise of God. And what we receive during the season of Advent in particular is that through it all, God will be faithful to us, and God will walk with us. And I think that's one of the wonderful opportunities that we have, especially in the Advent season, to touch again the promise of God in our lives and in our experience. I'm going to suggest that as we move into the Advent experience in a time of pandemic, that our prayer to God be that our prayer be rooted in those lovely words of John O'Donoghue, and that our prayer is that as we live in the experience, that God will open our eyes to the wonder of what is happening around us, even though we may live and be surrounded by people who are saying there is no wonder, there is just disappointment and panic and fear. The Jewish prayer book has some lovely language for the way in which we come into the day, and on the sheet that you have for this retreat, I've printed from a modern Jewish prayer book a short prayer for the morning and a short prayer for the evening that I think in some ways invites us to, as we go into the day, to be in the present moment and know that God is with us. And at the end of the day, to celebrate God who was with us in the present moment, and to pray that as night falls, God will continue to do with us in the night and in the darkness what God needs to do. The prayer for morning reads like this. Blessed are you, O God, who created the world with a word, and who fashioned your people from the dust and from the light. In our waking may we know you, breathing in us, breathing through us, creating us anew with your longing and love. And as we pray that prayer, look at the words, those lovely words, and think about the meaning of the word. And the prayer for the end of the day, blessed are you, O God, who dwells even in darkness, and who restores your creation with the gift of rest. Deliver your people from the troubles of the night, and let your peacefulness and grace be upon us. So a last thought that I want to leave you with for this morning. The story of the road to Emmaus reads quickly. But Emmaus is, it's the biblical Emmaus. There's still some dispute about where it actually is. But the Emmaus that you would visit in Israel today is about 7 kilometers from Jerusalem. Now, 7 kilometers over dusty roads that is a long walk. And you can imagine that on the walk to Emmaus, there was a lot of silence. And the last thought that I would like to leave with you is that one of the gifts that we can give ourselves, especially in the Advent season, is the gift of times for silence, times for quiet. Because it is in the quiet, in the quiet and the silence on the road to Emmaus, from sentence and silence and sentence and silence, that this progress in the story happens. It doesn't happen like it happens in a TV series where it's all neatly wrapped up in 24.8 minutes. It takes time and silence. During the summer, I came across a lovely book by a Canadian writer, an Ojibwe writer from Northern Ontario, who unfortunately died very early in British Columbia. His name is Richard Wagamese, and in his book Embers, which is a collection of his insights, he has a beautiful piece about silence, and maybe this can be another thought that we will carry with us over the next little while until we get back together this afternoon. He says, I am constantly surrounded by noise. TV, texts, the internet, music, meaningless small talk, my own thinking. All of it blocks my consciousness, my ability to hear the me that exists beneath the cacophony. I am my consciousness, my awareness of my new circumstances, my presence in every moment. So, I cultivate silence every morning. I sit in it, bask in it, wrap it around myself, and hear me and feel me. Then, wherever the day takes me, the people I meet are the beneficiaries of my having taken that time. They get the real me, not someone shaped and altered by the noise around me. Silence is the stuff of life. And with that, we'll see you this afternoon.